Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the editor of Cultural Encounters, a journal for the Theology of Culture. And it's my privilege to introduce to you one of our authors for Cultural Encounters, a longstanding friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Mae Cannon, whose area of expertise includes matters pertaining to Middle East peace and justice and the like. Currently, Dr. Cannon is the executive director for Churches for Middle East Peace, and no doubt she'll share a little bit more about that later, and an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. We could talk more about her work with World Vision and the like, but I'm going to leave that to her to share about that. What I'd like to focus on at the outset of this interview with my colleague Mae Cannon is the article she wrote for our journal Cultural Encounters several years ago, and it was part of a whole issue related to Middle East peace. It goes back several years, and the title of her article, found up with, I believe, some of your doctoral research, if I'm not mistaken, Mae, was Mischief Making in Palestine. Mischief Making in Palestine. American Protestant Christian Attitudes Toward the Holy Land from 1917 to 1949. Dr. Cannon is a historian by background, by her research, and though she's also engaged in other domains in terms of her research as well. And we'll leave it to her to speak to that subject. And that was published in volume 7 of Cultural Encounters, a journal for the Theology of Culture. And I know that she had a copy of it here just a minute ago. I love that cover design. I just love that cover design.
I went and found it. I was all excited. It actually was right on the shelf behind me.
So Mae, share with us what the article is about. What is the article about for this particular issue of Cultural Encounters on Middle East peace, Palestinians, Israeli, the whole discussion there?
Sure. Well, and I don't know if you know, Paul, that this article was the first academic article I published on the Middle East. So,
is that right?
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And
I remember I wrote some of it living in the Middle East. I was in Jerusalem, and I was, and so I remember you and I, being introduced and corresponding in that regard. But the title shares the title of my dissertation, Mischief Making in Palestine. That title comes from an article that was written in the Christian Century back in the 40s, where it was saying that Christian intervention was quite problematic. And so it was prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. So the Palestine it's referring to was pre-1948. And so mischief making in Palestine was the idea that particularly American Protestants in large part had very divergent ideas about the establishment of the State of Israel and very divergent ideas about the Arab community, which was the predominant population, the majority population prior to 1948. So the article looks specifically, I had to look up the dates, but 1917 to 1949 from the British Mandate period, looking at the history of what was happening there and specifically the history of what was American Christian involvement. And one of the main points of the article is that most people don't understand the establishment of the State of Israel was not supported by fundamentalist conservative Christians in 48. They were not the group, the group today that's considered the most pro-Israel is a very different group than the group that was the most supportive of the establishment of the state. It was Protestant liberals who were the ones who really were advocating for the State of Israel to be established. And there were lots of nuances and lots of details. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism was so prolific that there was a lot of support for the establishment of the Jewish State of Israel because people didn't want Jews coming to their own countries. And so anti-Semitism, for example, was one of the motivating factors for support of the establishment of the state.
And if I'm not mistaken, and I remember when I first came upon your argument, as I read the article, I thought I had no idea on a lot of this. I had no idea. I kept thinking I had no idea. I had no idea. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm thinking of the movie Chosen and the book Chosen. Am I wrong in thinking that at least an element of Hasidic Judaism also did not welcome the State of Israel? Am I wrong on that? Or, originally, am I wrong on that that was a problem in terms of the Messiah's coming, that it was like, we need not get involved in this. This is not our work. So
that's a great question.
Is that, am I wrong? Am I
Well,
right?
I can speak to an element of a part of the reality today. So I'll speak to a little bit of what I know. I'm not an expert on Judaism and historic Judaism, but I do know that there are a number of deeply, deeply religious Orthodox Jews, many of whom are settlers, who fundamentally believe that the establishment of the state of Israel was was humans taking in their own hands that which should be an act of God. And so they are very much supportive of, the establishment of an independent state of Palestine because of religious beliefs that the state of Israel is, human intervention in an unhelpful way. So there is definitely a segment of Jews who have that perspective.
Yeah, it's so complicated, right? I mean, with any tradition, Christian, Jewish, etc., Muslim, there are all kinds of views. Now, to your article, what was it, just out of refresh my memory, what was it that led to fundamentalist evangelical Christianity becoming a major card-carrying supporter for Zionism or Christian Zionism? What led to some of that?
Sure. I think the major turning point in that regard was the 60s, and particularly 1967 and the Six-Day War. And so when you think about what was happening in the United States at that time with the civil rights movement, conservative Christians were very, very concerned about what they were witnessing in the world. They felt in large part that the world was crumbling around them. You had the Vietnam War, you had all of this domestic civil unrest because of the civil rights movement, and that's leading into the movement of the 70s of feminism and, all of these things that were viewed by conservative Christians as being against Christian values, the free love movement of the hippies of the 70s, all of this. So in the middle of all of that, you have a major war between the Arab states, or a few Arab states, and Israel in 1967. And Israel wins the war in 6 days. So for Christians who had this idea of prophecy and this belief that the restoration of the Jewish people to their historic homeland plays a role in the second coming of Christ, here you have Israel defeat Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in 6 days, taking over control of the Sinai from Egypt, the West Bank from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria. So God must be on the side of the Jewish people of Israel because of, their victory in this war. And then upon that, you had some writers and Christian leaders like Hal Lindsey. You might have read This Late Great Planet Earth, came out in the early 1970s. And all of that was in parallel to the rise of the New Right and the association of American conservatism and Christianity with, the Republican Party. And so those were kind of parallel streams. And so that was the major shift, if you will.
And, sometimes I fear, I'll just put this on the table, that we have utilitarian motives as evangelicals for why we want the Jewish people to have rest in the promised land. I don't know how often it's really about them, but really about us and wanting Jesus to come back quickly. And even like we were looking for comfort and security, back there in the 60s, and we found it over there with Israel. I just fear that at times it could be utilitarian or self-serving motives. That's one of my nagging fears with some of these, with some of Christian Zionism. I'm not trying to disparage people. I'm just being honest with my concern, my reflection.
Well,
I don't know if you resonate with any of that.
The reality is a lot of Jews share that same concern, that same fear, that the Christian community has allegiances or alliances with either the state of Israel or with the Jewish community, for ulterior motives, if you will. And so there's all kinds of books written about, the dynamics of that relationship between Jews and Christians and some of the problematic aspects of it.
Interesting, striking. One other question in this regard, Mae, about your article and the work. Would you say one of the morals to the story is we have to be very guarded on intervention? I think it was England, if I'm not mistaken, one of the lords, if you will, who was responsible ultimately for dividing up that section of the world, right there in the late 40s. Is maybe the after effects or part of colonialism in that part of the world. I mean, European powers and America in our own way have been very effective in quote marks at dividing up Africa, dividing up, you know, parts of the Middle East and beyond. And sometimes we get involved in things that we really need to allow the local parties to figure out for themselves. Would that be something that's amoral to the story?
Absolutely. I mean, coming out of World War I, there was an agreement called the Sykes-Pico Agreement that determined which Western power would be mandated or have authority over different parts of the Middle East. And so, you know, it looked differently. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan was one of the few that wasn't under a mandate, but Palestine, historic Palestine at the time, was under British control, for example. And you know, the very divisions of those different communities were done without an understanding of tribal allegiances and without an understanding that there's not a monolithic culture, you know, that Egyptians are actually not Arabic, they're Coptic, for example, right? And so a lot of those nuances and things weren't understood by Western powers. And so I think it can have devastating effects. And in fact, we're even seeing wars in the Middle East today that in large part can go back in the history, are rooted in some of those false divisions that were applied by Western powers.
Well, and that makes me come up to the present tense. In addition to those wars, I can't help but think about the move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Jared Kushner's work. And again, you know, regardless of where someone is on the political spectrum, those who are going to watch or listen to this, I'm not trying to take I'm not trying to jab at Jared Kushner. I'm trying to do, I think, deeper reflection, hopefully. I wonder, based on that interventionist principle, when I watched him on an interview and he said, well, you know, almost it came across to me as flippantly dismissing Palestinians and saying, well, they've screwed up every other initiative. They need to get on board. If not, okay. But the posture to me did not come across as inviting toward Palestinians. And I fear that while some are saying it's been successful, what he's done, maybe the jury's still out on that. We'll see, because America has a lot of influence, a lot of power, and we can certainly get involved in the short term. Maybe things look successful, but I'm thinking long term down the road. It's complex. Every administration has struggled in this regard. This one too, no doubt. But your thoughts on that in terms of the present tense, in addition to the wars, America's ongoing efforts to broker peace in the Middle East?
It is untenable that our politics and our foreign policy vis-a-vis the Middle East will ever be successful if we don't have a holistic perspective. And so in that regard, be it Jared Kushner or any other political actor, if people truly care, you know, and they say that they're pro-Israel and they care about the future of Israel, which is 80% Jewish and 20% Arab, right? So it's not only the Jews who live in Israel, but it's the Arab citizens of Israel as well. If people truly care about the political future of the nation state of Israel, they have to care about their Palestinian neighbor. Yeah. So what grieved me so much about the move of the embassy was the pictures of, you know, these elite politicians, you know, celebrating the embassy being moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem at the very same time that 2 million Palestinians are living under siege in Gaza. And so you could see pictures of tear gas and bullets and all kinds of other things that the Palestinians living in Gaza are a part of their reality, you know, while there was this embassy move. And so if you truly care about justice and human rights for Palestinians, you have to care about their Jewish neighbors and you have to care about Israel. And if you truly care about a sustainable future and peace for Israel, you have to care about their Palestinian neighbors.
And also, Mae, I mean, this is just fascinating to me. I think of even a National Geographic article years ago that we highlighted in this particular journal issue, that many Palestinian Christians were leaving because of the upheaval in the Middle East, and the Christians were often seen as a mediating bridge between Jewish people and Muslim people, is my understanding. And, I think a lot of people are shocked when I say to them, there are many Palestinian Christians. Not that we should only be concerned for fellow Christians, we should be concerned for Jews and Muslims too who don't believe in Jesus, but still, I mean, Palestinian Christians, Jesus, he probably would have gotten tear gas. I mean, just when you look at the Gospels and such, as a Palestinian Jew in Nazareth, and such, he was not part of the elite. And I think that he wasn't part of the power structures. Blessed are the poor. Cursed are those who are rich. Blessed are those who mourn. And when we think of the Beatitudes, Sermon on the Plain, Sermon, in Luke, and Sermon on the Mount, Beatitudes, Sermon on the Mount, Matthew's Gospel. Where would Jesus be in all this? And I think sometimes our conception of Jesus are so foreign to the Gospels. And he loved both Jews and Palestinians. He loved all peoples and had no trouble loving both and reconciling both at the same time. And I think we have a long way to go as the American church, a long way to go, myself included.
I think so too.
So what led you to write this article, and what led you to pursue this? I mean, you're not Palestinian. I don't think you're Jewish as such, but this has been a passion of yours for a long time. Before your doctoral work, no doubt. But in your doctoral work, University of California? Am I correct there?
Good memory.
And also your work with World Vision and your current work. What led you to write this article and this research? What led to this pursuit?
So I've been called to two things in my life. The first thing was to ministry. And when I was called to ministry, I didn't even have a theology that allowed for women to be in ministry. And so I went to seminary without that theological framework. And now I'm ordained. So I came to believe that God has called and equipped all men and women and all people to use their gifts in the context of ministry and the spreading of the gospel. But my second calling was to the Middle East. And it actually was a distinct moment. I had dreamt of going to Israel since I was a little girl. I was raised in a secular Zionist home. I say that sometimes when I'm speaking to synagogues and they're all like, "You were Jewish?" And I was like, "No." My family was not religious, if you will, but was politically Zionist. And so very, very supportive of the state of Israel. And my parents actually bought me a ticket to Israel when I graduated from high school, and it took 15 years before I actually was able to go. So just a confluence of events, some of them political in the Middle East, some of them personal. And when I finally did go, the first time was in 2009. I was in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is where it's believed that Golgotha and Christ was crucified. And underneath Golgotha, so that there's a huge stone and you can climb up these little stairs, and many people often kiss the stone of Golgotha. But underneath it, there's a chapel called Adam's Chapel. And the tradition goes that that's where the bones of Adam and Eve were buried. And the idea was that when Christ was crucified on the cross, that his blood actually dripped down upon the bones of Adam and Eve so that the very first original sin would be forgiven, that Christ died for all, for the forgiveness of sins. And so I was sitting in Adam's Chapel. I was on this pilgrimage, and I had my first book coming out, Social Justice Handbook on Global Justice Issues. And I had an overwhelming sense in my spirit that God was calling me to that place, and I just wept. And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know anything, but I was doing a PhD. I was pastoring in a church. And I went back to my dissertation advisor and said, I think that I need to write about Israel. And he said, well, you do know your PhD's in American history, don't you? But I ended up being able to write about the relationship with American Protestants in Israel and Palestine.
Oh, what a great story. That's amazing. That's enriching. So you've talked about the article. You've talked about what led to your research, your dissertation. You were working on justice. You continue to work on justice themes. What are your current research projects?
So I actually completed a second doctorate, a doctorate of ministry and spiritual formation. And so the main project of that thesis, which the thesis is done, but I'm now working on that, becoming a book project, is on the spiritually transformative process of learning to love your enemy. And I felt like I needed to study that and write that because I don't know the answer. Or, I felt like it actually, when I started to work on Israel and started to work with the Palestinian Christian community, and of course I work with a number of Israelis as well, I have never had more enemies. I won't even tell you all of the things that I've been called online. I always say, please don't Google me. But I mean, I've been called the Antichrist. I've been called just horrific things. And I never really had enemies before. And now, I mean, I hope I don't have enemies, but I know that there are people who see me as their enemy. And so I really wanted to work on what's the process. Jesus says, love your enemies. So what's that mean in reality?
And you have found that in Christian circles too?
I have found that conservative Christians are often the ones leading the way.
And that is so painful. I consider myself an Orthodox Christian. I am an Orthodox Christian, a historic Orthodox Christian, and that's what I see you as being. And it's hard when people within our own particular, depending on what one means by conservative, right? I mean, it can mean so many different things to so many people, but historic Orthodox, biblical, theological Christian faith, that's what you are. It's really hard when people from one's own in-group, broadly speaking, take shot. That's the hardest thing. I mean, I can take it from a lot of people, but it's hardest when it's closest to home, in my estimation. I don't know if you feel the same way, but that's really hard.
Yeah. I think, the question for me is, how do we respond faithfully? And when do you take on the issues and say, no, that's not true. What you're saying about me is not true. And when do you ignore it? And, how do you not be self-defensive? And yet, how do you also be an advocate? And so those are all kind of a part of the struggle.
Yeah. And so your current research projects, even in the midst of all that pain and struggle, I mean, I've interviewed you for New Wine, New Wineskins on your work with spirituality, just spirituality. You have your newest book is on hashtag activism, how to have a more comprehensive view than just hashtagging about something, so to speak. That work, other work that you're engaged in?
Yeah, I have a couple other book projects. I'm working on a book called The Faithful Remnant about Christians in the Middle East, but specifically the spirituality of Christians in the Middle East. And so the model of it is very similar to Social Justice Handbook. Most Western Christians don't know the difference. You mentioned Orthodox. So, they wouldn't know the difference between Coptic Orthodox or Greek Orthodox or Armenian Orthodox. And so it's a book hoping to introduce the faithful remnant of Christians where Christianity began, to the broader Western world, if you will.
Yeah. And so you're talking about uppercase O, and I was simply talking about lowercase O Orthodox. Right. But I have learned greatly. One of my professors was John Zuzulus, the great Greek Orthodox theologian from Athens. And so I've learned a lot from Orthodox. So you're going to be dealing with Eastern thought forms in church and our brothers and sisters in Christ from these other traditions.
That's right. Yep.
Fascinating. Well, Dr. Cannon, Reverend Dr. Cannon, thank you very much for your time as we were engaging your article, Mischief Making in Palestine, American Protestant Christian Attitudes Toward the Holy Land, 1917 to 1949 for Cultural Encounters, a journal for the Theology and Culture. And so people can go to our website, Cultural Encounters, to find out more about that article, and or can contact us about Dr. Cannon's article, and then also the journal issue as a whole. And I encourage you to go to Amazon and what's your website, Mae?
MaeCannon.com. So M-A-E. Yep.
Mae.cannon.com?
MaeCannon.com.
Oh, MaeCannon.com. Yep. And so thank you very much for your time, Mae. It's always good to connect with you, and just grateful for your scholarship, your prophetic vision, and your work as a Christian leader. So thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you.
Well, on behalf of Dr. Mae Cannon, Paul Louis Metzger, thank you for joining us for this author profile discussion for Cultural Encounters, a journal for the Theology of Culture. Blessings to you all. Goodbye.